So, picking back up on our section on status organizing processes and expectation states. Your activity 4 is now graded. And some comments I had about activity 4, some things that I saw, many of you did an excellent job. And so, a couple of things to note is first, so when I'm going through these activities, there's 40 of them to grade. And again, they're, written responses, so they take a little while to grade. And I do read everyone's responses. So each time I grade an activity, I start maybe at the beginning or start from the bottom up, or I start somewhere in the middle. So I'm starting in a different section of students each time, especially at the beginning when I'm grading. Uh, I tend to have more energy and I'm, getting more into the details, the nitty gritty of people's assignments. And so, just to make sure that I'm consistent throughout the semester, I'll start at a different place. And so, some of the activities you'll get um, more comments, more detailed comments, and sometimes you'll get just kind of general comments. So, just keep that in mind as you look at the comments on these. I want to make sure that I'm really engaged in everyone's activity and that I'm providing comments that are both helpful, but also if I say like that's a good example or that makes a lot of sense, it's not just like, oh, that's a good job, great example. It's an indication that, hey, this is something that you did that was really good. Um, so just keep that in mind. It's not just like, oh, you did a great job. It's like you did a great job, but also this is good. Like you're right on track. Um, and then another thing I noticed while grading activity 4 is that make sure that you're answering all of the questions. So especially for this particular activity, each question is multiple questions, but it's designed to specifically hit on different dimensions of affect and emotion. And so the question might seem somewhat similar to another that you've answered, but it's really asking you to kind of access um, similar information from a slightly different perspective. And so make sure that you're answering all of those questions because they are building on one another and they are hitting on most, if not all, of the concepts that we discuss in that section. And also, just in terms of grading, if you didn't answer one of the questions, I will typically go in and highlight that and add the question in the comment so that you know that you got points off for not answering that particular question or that half of the question. So keep an eye out for that and make sure that your responses answer all the questions. Your quiz 4 is graded. Um, Activity 5 is due Friday at 11:59 p.m. And make sure to watch the supplementary videos for this week. And the videos that I've added for this week are two of them in particular are not necessarily related to status organizing processing and processes and expectation states, but they are somewhat related and might help give you a bit of context about this particular section. And so there's one of those videos for psychology, one of those videos for sociology, and it's just showing that there are different ways to approach these questions that we answer in social psychology. So, as a quick refresher, where we left off on status characteristics theory, which focuses on the way certain evaluations or attitudes shape interactional behavior. And so in the past, we have discussed more cognitive and group processes involved in stereotyping, but in this section in particular, we examined the impact that these processes have on interpersonal behavior. And so there are two types of status characteristics. So when we're evaluating others, perhaps forming performance expectations, we are looking at diffuse and specific status characteristics. Diffuse status characteristics activate general and specific expectations about performance, whereas specific status characteristics generate distinct expectations about specific abilities. And some of the assumptions are that the theory seeks to explain how beliefs about status characteristics get translated into performance expectations, which then go on to shape the behavior of individuals in a group. So, in other words, it explores the process of attributing specific abilities to individuals based on the status characteristics they possess. And at the heart of this theory, there are five assumptions that link beliefs about status to behavior. And so today we're going to cover those five assumptions. The first is the salience assumption. So, according to the salience assumption, for any attribute to affect performance expectations, it must be socially significant for the actors in the setting. A status characteristic is salient if it either differentiates actors from one another or if actors believe that the characteristic is relevant to completing the group's task. Consequently, situational goals and the way actors compare one another on the characteristic impact how and if a status characteristic affects performance expectations. So, the same characteristic, for example, having a college degree, can advantage an actor in one setting. Perhaps that's with a group um, uh, with less education overall. It can also have no impact in another setting. So, in a group where everyone has university degrees, but it can also disadvantage the actor in a third setting. And that would be in a setting with people who are more educated. And so it's important to note that no status characteristic advantages or disadvantages an actor in all settings. So, in addition, for the salience assumption, a group member's performance expectancy determines their positioning in the power and prestige order of the group. So, in terms of performance expectancies, those with higher performance expectancies will be higher in this order. And some advantages and opportunities associated with this are that higher positioning entails greater opportunities to perform, initiate problem solving, higher evaluations, and reject influence from other group members and to influence others in the group. So that means if you have there are higher performance expectations for you, that means that you will be higher in that power and prestige order, and you will have more opportunities to perform and receive those positive evaluations. You'll have more opportunities in terms of problem solving, but you'll also, again, going back to our discussion on deferring to those in the group who we perceive to be of greater status, to have higher performance expectations, we tend to defer to those people. And because of that, that person will have more of an opportunity to influence other group members while being less susceptible to influence from others. Then we have the burden of proof assumption. The burden of proof assumption concerns the way status characteristics that differentiate actors but are not initially relevant to the performance of the group's task and how they impact the formation of performance expectations. And so, again, all salient information is incorporated unless something in the setting explicitly dissociates the status characteristic from the task. So, for example, if gender is salient in a setting, it will differentiate the performance expectations for those present, even though gender itself is not relevant to the task at hand. It is through the burden of proof process that diffuse status characteristics such as gender, age, race, and social class have modest but pervasive effects on the status hierarchies that emerge across a large range of settings in which they have no obvious task relevance. And then we have what is called the sequencing assumption. The sequencing assumption specifies that what happens in the more complicated situation when actors either enter or leave an existing social setting. The main point is no status or competence information is lost. The performance expectations that formed in one encounter carry over to the next encounter, even if the specific actors change. This assumption has been used to intervene in the status generalization process. For example, if a man observes a woman performing a task better than he does, this can positively impact the performance expectations he forms for women in future encounters. However, the effect may wear off over time without a booster experience. And then we have the aggregate assumption. So, the aggregate assumption explains how the status information associated with multiple characteristics is combined to form aggregated performance expectations. In groups, people often differ from one another on several status characteristics at the same time. And often, these multiple status characteristics generate inconsistent expectations for performance. It offers a procedure for making predictions for the order of performance expectations actors will construct from a given set of salient status characteristics. And so, some examples of this in terms of so we said that it explains how status information associated with multiple characteristics is combined to form kind of aggregated performance expectations. So we can think of if we going back to let's use different social identities for example. So we'll use like social class and education. So we know that these are ranked in terms of status in these different hierarchies. So typically, those with higher education are of higher status, and those who are of higher social class are also of higher status. But since we have multiple characteristics that may be evident in a given situation. Some of these can be um, they're not of equal status. And so we might combine, for example, just these two to create a kind of this aggregated performance expectations based on these statuses. So let's say someone is highly educated, but they are working class, or someone is upper middle class, but they have very little education. And so, again, these things are of different status. They have different, status value attached to them. So we might like aggregate these, um, and that could be for better or for worse. Um, Perhaps someone, um, depending on what the group values, depending on what's relevant to that particular task. And so then we have the comparison assumption, which describes how aggregated performance assumptions are translated into behavior. Relative aggregated performance expectations for any two actors are compared. The higher the expectations that an actor holds for herself compared to another actor, the greater the expectation advantage she will have over the second actor. The greater the performance expectation advantage of one actor over another, the more likely the first actor will be to receive opportunities to act, the more likely she will be to accept the opportunity to act, and the more positive she will be evaluated in terms of her action, and the more likely she will be to reject influence when the two actors disagree. And so, again, what's important to remember about the comparison assumption is it explains how these aggregated performance assumptions are translated into behavior. And these are so we then, once we've aggregated these assumptions based on these multiple characteristics, we compare all group members relative to each other. So, moving on to rewards and performance expectations. So, when we discuss rewards um, in terms of performance expectations, it's important to remember that differential distribution of rewards, like status characteristics, can actually create a status hierarchy among actors or modify positions in an existing hierarchy. So, again, as a quick refresher about the formation of performance expectations and status hierarchies, Monday we covered the socially significant characteristics. So reward and or so today we're going to cover social rewards, and so that's the second. And we will get into some behavioral interchange patterns as well. Um, but again, we're focusing today on rewards primarily. So now that you have the assumptions associated um, with those socially significant characteristics, the assumptions that are made in terms of status characteristics theory, or moving on to social rewards, which then are part of how we create performance expectations, which are then translated into behavioral inequalities and status hierarchies within groups. So, recall the expectation states theory suggests three processes by which differentiated performance expectations emerge. We have discussed the impact of salient status characteristics. So now we will turn to the other processes, beginning with the impact of socially valued rewards. The theory argues that when a socially valued reward is distributed unequally among members of a group, the actors will infer performance expectations from their reward differences. In this way, the differential distribution of rewards, like status characteristics, can actually create a status hierarchy among actors or modify positions in an existing hierarchy. One study showed that when a third party gave differential rewards to group members who had no other basis for evaluating their performance on a shared task, the members used the reward differences to infer abilities, um, to infer ability differences. Another study showed that allocating differential pay levels to participants in an experiment created corresponding influence hierarchies among them during these interactions. And these results highlight how the power or good luck represented in the unequal possession of rewards generates status distinctions that are considered legitimate by those in the setting. By creating performance expectations, the unequal rewards appear to be deserved and thus justify um, this respect and deference and influence that we give to the person who is receiving these rewards. And so, again, as we covered in the last slide, it's important to note that in the same way, the differential distribution of rewards, like status characteristics, can actually create a status hierarchy among actors or modify positions in existing hierarchies. And so I keep repeating this because we focused a lot on status characteristics and how we evaluate others. And of course, those can change over time once you gain more information about a person. But rewards are something that can also influence even the most established hierarchies. When you start seeing that someone is getting extra rewards, whether it be more praise, more compensation, more help, whatever the case may be. And because of that, we believe that this person must deserve that and therefore must be more competent and deserving and of higher status than we are, as well as other group members. So, those who are receiving rewards, particularly from those in a higher status position, we tend to associate that with their status position in the hierarchy and can even um, associate that with our perceptions of competence and their ability to contribute to a task. And so the example here is of a study that showed that allocating differential pay levels to participants in an experiment created these corresponding influence hierarchies among them during this interaction. And so, looking at something like rewards, like let's say you are um, interested in the group dynamics. You're interested in who is of higher status, who is of lower status, and so some indicators, especially in terms of being able to observe these things um, over time and in real time. It's a bit difficult to um, just in kind of an everyday way, like formally in research is one thing, but in an everyday sense, it's really difficult to um, really pinpoint people's performance expectations in terms of status characteristics. But looking at rewards and the distribution of rewards can tell you a lot about the status hierarchy within a group. Although that doesn't necessarily mean that those who are receiving more rewards are of higher status in terms of their ability to contribute, but perhaps higher status in how they are perceived by their peers and perceived by those in power. So that's something that you can really actually see if you know what you're looking for. So the third factor that affects performance expectations are behavioral interchange patterns. So, in addition to status characteristics and rewards, a third factor that can have independent effects on performance expectations is the behavioral interchange pattern that develops among two or more actors. So, such a pattern occurs between two or more actors when one engages in assertive higher status behaviors. So, initiating speech first, making a task suggestion, resisting change in the face of disagreement. So, resisting that influence. And that these are responded to with deferential lower status behavior by the others in the group. So, that could be hesitating to speak, positively evaluating the other's suggestion, and changing to agree with the other. So, the more frequently these types of patterns are repeated between actors, the more likely the actors are to view the behavioral patterns as cultural status typifications, which are shared beliefs about typical high status, low status, leader follower behaviors. And so, whether or not these are necessarily based in some sort of um, rooted in biology, physiology, those types of things, while they might be like innate human behaviors, is not necessarily what we're concerned with. And of course, there's a lot of research on certain types of like posture being one, like what are postures that signify that someone is more dominant of a higher status, and what are postures of someone who's of lower status. So you can think back to the video that was posted, I believe, last week of the FBI agent uh, evaluating someone's uh, gestures and body language. And that was related to affect and emotion because this person talks about the emotions that this person might be feeling while they're demonstrating certain gestures and body language. But you can think about it here too, as what does your body language communicate? What does your behavior in relation to others communicate? And we've talked about like facial expressions and expressing anger, or emotional labor and impression management, and what gestures uh, correspond to what meaning. Like in the chapter or the section on symbolic interaction, you looked at like the Hunger Games, like Effie and her body language and what that communicated to the crowd, what that said about her change of attitude and beliefs and her experiences. But when we're thinking about it here, we're thinking about behavior. And so that's, the speech you use, the way you interact and speak with others, the way the gestures you make, your posture, all of those things. What do they communicate in terms of status? And so here, some of the examples are that higher status behaviors could correspond to things like initiating speech, making task suggestions, resisting change, so resisting influence from others. Whereas lower status behaviors could be like hesitating to speak, positively evaluating the other's suggestions, or changing to agree with the other. And so again, these aren't doesn't necessarily mean these are like rooted in some like innate human behavior, or that these are absolutely true across all situations, but it's something to look for and consider in terms of status. And it's something that has been observed in the research in terms of the creation of performance expectations. So, again, it's not really focused on that these things always mean that someone is of higher or lower status. It's more interested in those cultural assumptions and understandings based on particular ways of interacting with others. So you might think about like eye contact. Someone who is not necessarily engaging in direct eye contact or eye contact at all might be seen as more submissive to the person with whom they're interacting. And that may or may not be the case. You don't know. But we're thinking about the things that we associate to that particular behavior in regards to the formation of performance expectations. So if we're looking for, again, a group project at school and we're looking for someone's going to do the presentation for the group, okay, well, we're going to be thinking about the person who is making eye contact and who is more likely to speak. They're going to show that confidence and that higher status in their presentation as opposed to someone who isn't doing those things. But you can also watch this in interactions between people of higher and lower statuses. And by that, I mean not necessarily your assumption of their status, but um, in those roles that are by their very nature of higher and lower status. So between like your boss and other employees, or yourself interacting with your boss, you can kind of focus on these different behaviors and what they might indicate in terms of your relative status. And so, following the common assumption that people speak up more confidently about things at which they have more experience. Salient status typifications induce actors to assume that the more assertive actor is more competent at the task than the more deferential actor, creating differential performance expectations for them. Behavior interchange patterns shape performance expectations most powerfully among those actors in a group who are equals in both their external status characteristics and their reward levels, such as between women in a mixed sex group. Behavioral interchange patterns are the means by which expectation states theory accounts for the development of status structures in groups of people who are very similar. So, when actors differ in status characteristics, the differentiated performance expectations created by status characteristics shape the actor's verbal and nonverbal assertiveness. Consequently, these differences in status characteristics shape behavioral interchange patterns. So, one study showed that when mixed sex dyads shifted from a gender neutral task where the man had a status advantage to a more feminine typed task where the woman had a status advantage, the actors' participation rates in assertive nonverbal behaviors reversed from a pattern of favoring the man to one favoring the woman. Thus, between actors who already differ on status characteristics, behavior interchange patterns often add little new information to the existing order of performance expectations. And so, what's important to note here um, is that, again, these behavioral interchange patterns shape performance expectations the most among actors in a group who are, for the most part, equals in both their external status characteristics and their reward levels. So, once we've again, when there's not much to go off of in terms of the information available in terms of these status characteristics, and everyone is receiving the same amount of rewards, or no one is receiving rewards at all. The next thing that we go to are behavioral interchange. So that's just another way we evaluate members in a group to begin to form these status hierarchies. And so it's not to say that these other things don't come into play. You can employ all three strategies at once. You can draw information from all three, but this is particularly powerful in groups where you don't have a lot of information to create a status hierarchy in terms of status characteristics or rewards. And so, again, going back to that example, when actors differ in status characteristics, the differentiated performance expectations created by status characteristics shape the actor's verbal and nonverbal assertiveness. Consequently, differences in status characteristics shape behavioral interchange patterns. And so, what they're saying here and what they've observed in this particular area of research, which again is primarily done on sex and gender, um, which again, as I said yesterday, those are often conflated, especially because they were studies that were done in like the 80s and 90s, and maybe even the early 2000s. But so I'll try to change those and make that as clear as I can. Sometimes the way they discuss it is more similar to our current conception of gender, and sometimes it's more similar to um, that binary, our binary definition of sex. So I'll try to be clear on those examples because most of the research in this area, particularly the earliest and those seminal pieces, focus on sex and gender. So, like one study, for example, showed that when mixed sex dyads shifted from a gender neutral task where the man had or the male had a status advantage to a more feminine type task where the woman had a status advantage, the actor's participation rates and assertiveness or assertive behavior reversed from a pattern favoring the man or the male to one favoring the woman. So what this says is that we're all kind of aware of these different of our own status characteristics. We're aware of the personal role and social identities that we associate with ourselves, and we can recognize those many times in others. And so we, in relation to each other. And so we're aware of these things, and that influences the way in which we interact with one another. And given the situation at hand, given the task, given the context, so the definition of the situation, given those things will influence our interactions. Um, so again, it's something depending on the context and how it's typed. So like yesterday, we discussed specific status characteristics. Um, so like mathematical ability, writing ability. If the task at hand is something like creative writing, which is typically typed as something that is more feminine, whereas mathematical ability is often typed as something that is more masculine, um, we will behave differently given the context and given our own status characteristics. And that will influence who has higher status in that particular task group. But that is all for today. Next week, we will get into some really fun and interesting examples. I went through a lot of the research in this area and found a lot of different examples that I think you all will find really interesting. At least I found them interesting because regardless of what you end up doing in your life in terms of a career, um, and even outside of that, you will always be interacting within groups. And so this information I believe will come in handy and will be really interesting in terms of status hierarchies within groups and how that influences behavior within groups, the distribution of resources and rewards, um, and kind of the nature of those interactions. And so I'm really excited about some of the examples we'll go over. And then later on Wednesday, we'll go over some of the critiques and kind of wrap everything up for this section so that we can move into the next. But other than that, your activity 5 is due Friday, and I hope you all have a great rest of your week. Thanks.